우리 북한 인권의 어머니 수잔 솔티 여사 초청 강연회가 오늘 드디어 개최됩니다. 행사 직전에 여러 이제 미디어 여러분들 대표님들을 모시고 먼저 기자회견을 갖도록 하겠습니다.
It's wonderful to be here, and I'm so impressed by the warm welcome by the government of South Korea, as well as the local community, and I'm looking forward to the given remarks tonight.
Yeah, today what are you gonna do mention about your speech?
Well, I'm focusing on what we should be doing regarding the peaceful unification of Korea. And I will be focusing very briefly on what the human rights situation is in North Korea. I want to touch upon some of the dramatic changes that have happened internally in North Korea that aren't necessarily appreciated by the outside world, but we need to look at some of the things that happened during the last couple of decades that have changed things internally very dramatically. And then I'm going to talk about the most important thing is what are the kinds of things we should be doing now, especially with the escalating tensions. And I have a series of things I'm going to mention that we need to be focusing our attention on as far as how to deal with the current regime of the Kim Jong-un regime. And what I think is the two most important things are to save the refugees that are in detention in China right now. That has got to have all of our attention. There's at least 600 children, women, and men that are in detention centers in China who escaped North Korea over the last couple of years. Anyone who escaped North Korea over the last couple of years could have only done so if they had the means to be able to pay for traffickers and pay bribes to get out. That means that they were either members of the Korean Workers' Party and they had the means because of their stature in North Korea, or they have family in South Korea who sent funds to help them escape. Now what that means is if they are forcibly repatriated to North Korea, as China has been doing, in violation of its international treaty obligations, they will be executed. So it's a very critical situation because the border is still shut down. The Chinese have not been able to repatriate them. But we believe that calling upon China to act humanely and engaging with China on this, all these lives can be saved. And we believe that China would be open to that because it has demonstrated that the dictatorship in China has demonstrated a willingness to relocate refugees, especially when North Korea is causing a lot of provocations. Historically, when they've been threatening with developing their nuclear program, when they've been firing off missiles, historically, China's been more than willing to let refugees come to South Korea. And I think it's really important for the Yoon administration, of course, to point out to China that these are citizens of South Korea under the South Korean Constitution. And all we're asking is for China to honor its international treaty obligations and allow them safe passage and act humanely regarding these refugees. So that is a number one priority. And it should be a priority not just of South Korea, but the international community should be helping to engage on this because China is a signatory to the international, the Refugee Convention. So all we're asking is for China to honor its treaty obligations. And then the second priority is to relaunch the information campaign. One of the things I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to go into very specific detail during my remarks, but we were winning the information campaign. We were literally winning the information campaign, and it's because the governments of President Lee and President Park partnered with the North Korean escapees that were living in South Korea, and were very much engaged in reaching out to people in North Korea. And we should be using all methods possible, radio broadcasting, reaching people in North Korea by land, by sea, and by air. Very tragically, under the Moon government, we saw the South Korean government pull back from doing any of these activities. And these activities were, in fact, hugely successful. We know that the people of North Korea, we believe at least 60% were accessing information from the outside world. One of the reasons why we know these activities are so successful is because Kim Jong-un and Kim Yo-jong have demanded that they be stopped. Anything that they're demanding be ended means it must be having an impact. And so we've continued to broadcast Free North Korea Radio, which is a unique partnership between Americans, freedom-loving Americans, and North Korean escapees that ensures that every morning North Koreans have access to true information. And we broadcast every morning and every evening. Like I mentioned, it's a unique partnership between freedom-loving Americans and North Korean escapees. But in addition, we should be redoing the balloon launches and the rice bottle launches. Those were also having an impact. We need to put the loudspeakers back up at the DMZ. Most of the North Korean ground forces are located within 100 kilometers of the DMZ, which is why Kim Jong-un was demanding that the loudspeakers be turned off, because we were reaching the military. And so we need to articulate more today than ever before to that regime that there are people in South Korea and America and Japan that all they want for the people of North Korea is to share with them the benefits of freedom and bring about what Hwang Jang-yap always talked about. The miracle of the Tangdong could happen. It can replicate the miracle of the Han if North Koreans are given the freedom to be able to do that. That's the kind of thing we should be communicating to people in North Korea, especially during the escalating tensions. I've always believed that there's people in that regime that want to see the end of the dictatorship. And we know that because they're the ones that are getting hauled off in the middle of Korean Workers' Party meetings and executed. We know that because they're the ones that are risking their lives to escape. And we need to be articulating that, especially now, because the situation has gotten so much worse, and we need to be focusing on the human rights conditions. We need the people of North Korea to know how much we actually care about them, especially Americans having a very important role to play because we let the peninsula be divided. There was a time when we could have ended that division, and so I think that Americans especially have a moral obligation to speak out on these human rights issues, because the regime lies and brainwashes their people from childhood to think that we're their enemy, to think that we occupy South Korea, to think that we want their demise, when in fact if I walked up to a typical American right now, if I stepped out of here and asked them what they think about North Korea, they would be concerned about the provocations, but the thing they'd be most concerned about is the horrible stories they're hearing about what's happening to the people of North Korea. And more Americans, I think more Korean Americans know about how horrible things are in North Korea than South Koreans. And so that's the kinds of things that I'll be talking about during the remarks today.
Nowadays, the Korean Peninsula has a tension because of the North Korea has the ICBM and then nuclear issue. So are you concerning to change your activity nowadays? The Korean Peninsula has tensions.
I'm hoping that all the things that I have been saying for over 20 years, and that is what Hwang Jang-yap said in 1997. He said, the Achilles heel of the Kim regime is human rights. North Korea will never give up its nuclear weapons. It will use provocations to extract concessions from South Korea and the United States. It'll never give up its nuclear weapons. We have to remember that Kim Jong-un never acts for the benefit of his people. He only acts for the benefit of his regime. And so I'm hoping that we've reached a point where we realize the failed mistakes that have been happening. And I blame both Republicans and Democrats. I blame both parties for being a part of that, for not putting human rights first on the agenda in dealing with North Korea, and thinking that we can negotiate with a dictatorship that doesn't care about its own people. We think that when we negotiate with the Kim regime that we're negotiating from the same set of standards that we have, and we're not. And that's why these negotiations have always failed, because we let ourselves be manipulated and we don't recognize the horrific things that are happening to the North Korean people. We should be focusing on them.
Okay, so finally, what Korean have to do nowadays for the North Koreans?
You mean South Korea or Korean Americans or?
Yeah, the Korean Americans live in America.
I think the most important thing they can do is get involved in the North Korea human rights movement, support the work of the North Korean defectors. No one knows best how to communicate and what needs to be said to the people in North Korea than those who've escaped. we need to be giving them the support. And I'm really proud of the fact that we are very much involved with helping the North Korean defector NGOs, whether it's doing rice bottle launches or balloon launches, or as I mentioned, the radio broadcast that's on every morning and every evening. It's all done with the support of Americans, Korean American churches, individual Americans, citizens that care deeply for the people of North Korea, supporting their efforts and financing their work, because they have been so beat down and put down and oppressed during the Moon government, which did so much damage to the work that they were doing. It literally, the government of the administration of Moon Jae-in, he literally worked with the Kim dictatorship to put North Korea back in the dark. And they were never more educated and informed about the outside world until about 2018. But Moon Jae-in has plunged them back into darkness by the things that he did to cut off the information campaign. So we need to relaunch those efforts. We know, like, for example, that South Korean K-pop music, South Korean soap operas, Western movies, people were watching those, and North Koreans were actually trying to adopt some of the same terms, some of the same clothes, some of the same hairstyle. And that's why in December 2020, Kim Jong-un enacted this anti-reactionary thought campaign, this law banning or threatening that anybody that was caught singing Korean K-pop or modeling South Korean clothing, that they would be sent to hard labor or possibly execution. That shows you that the South Korean culture was infiltrating North Korea, and that's why there was this huge crackdown. And then Kim Jong-un also brilliantly used COVID as well to further suppress the people there. And of course, closing the border has had a serious impact on the flow of information. But that's why all the techniques that we're using can happen without, even if the border's closed. Radio broadcasting, reaching people by land, sea, and air can still happen, even if we can't do things across the border. I do think the border's going to open, but sometime before the end of the year, possibly early next year. That's why we need to save the refugees right away.
I see.
지금 방금 국경이 내년에 열릴 거라고 말씀하신 건가요?
지금 팬데믹 때문에 이제 북한이 국경을 막았는데, 그래도 아까 조금 말씀하신 게 좀 디벨롭하면 그 국경이 열리기 전에 지금 중국에 있는 한 600여 명의 이제 북한 탈북 어린이 또 어른 다 합쳐서 그분들을 빨리 이제 한국으로 이제 데리고 올 수 있는 방법을 열심히 간구하고 계시다는 그런 말씀하셨어요.
예, 한 600명 정도 아까 있다고 그러셨는데 그 사람들을 구조하기 위한 단체들이 이미 다 있을 거죠?
His question is there's about 600 people in China. Is there organizations who could execute to get them out of China?
Well, there's the problem is that they're in detention centers. They're in detention centers, so they're being held by Chinese. And one thing I can tell you, two things that are very encouraging, I can share with you. Number one, yesterday marks the 1-year anniversary of when the Kim family was flown directly from China to South Korea.
Okay. 지금
This family of 4. And yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of them reaching South Korea. That showed the Chinese were willing to allow this family to come, and that's because the South Korean government engaged with the Chinese and they were able to be saved. And if they had been sent back to North Korea, they would have been killed, because they were high enough to be able to come, high enough in the regime, they were able to cross the border and escape in the beginning of 2021. And so they were detained in China, but they were released exactly 1 year ago yesterday. Second thing is, we have heard, I was just in South Korea at the end of September, and I was able to talk to some people who have family members that are being detained. And those family members have been shown great compassion by the Chinese prison officials, because those Chinese prison officials know these were people that were just trying to reach their families. These were criminals. The only reason why they're in detention is because they crossed the border illegally, but they were crossing the border because they were trying to get to their families. And so that we've heard some credible reports from people who've been in touch with their loved ones that are in detention. And that shows us that even the Chinese recognize these are innocent children, women, and men that were just trying to get to freedom, to just trying to get to their families in South Korea. So I'm encouraged that we could have a really great outcome if we continue to engage on this.
네. 예, 지금 600명이 지금 현재 수감되어 있는 중이라서 이제 중국 정부에서 이제 사실 그분들 한국을 보내줘야 되는 거예요. 근데 좋은 예 중에 하나가 지금 김 씨 가족 4명이 지금 여기 한국으로 이제 비행기를 타고 이제 중국 정부에서 보내줬어요. 한국으로. 그래서 딱 어제가 1년이 됐는데 그런 방법으로 지금 중국 정부가 이제 한국 정부하고 계속 협조만 해주면 사실 그 600명들을 다 이제 구출해낼 수 있는 방법이고 그 사람들이 거기서 수감되어 있는 이유가 사실은 북한에서 탈북을 했는데 그게 이제 죄라고 그래서 중국 정부에 잡혀서 수감이 돼 있지만 그 중국 정부 자체에서만 협조를 하면 그건 충분히 쉽게 그 사람들을 이제 구해낼 수 있는 방법이라고 말씀하셨습니다.
아까 뭐 문정부 때 문제들에 대한 이야기를 해주셨는데 지금 윤 정부에 들어와서 변화하는 모습을 보고 있는지 좀.
Okay, you have mentioned there has been a lot of problems the Moon Jae-in era, but is there some change since the Yoon Suk-yeol took over as a president of the policy against North
Well,
Korea?
President Yoon was elected president by the narrowest margin in South Korean presidential history. I contend that the margin of victory was because the North Korean escapees living in South Korea worked their hearts out because they had suffered so much under the Moon government. For example, those 2 fishermen that were sent back, we think there were hundreds of others that they actually repatriated. They did exactly what we complained about what China was doing, the Moon administration, and they gutted all the support that the North Koreans were getting. We know of a mother and son that starved to death in South Korea, and we know that the North Korean escapees living in South Korea saw this last election as literally life or death for them, because they would have South Korea was poised to elect a communist versus Yoon, who is somebody who believes in freedom and the liberal democracy of South Korea. So I absolutely have seen a complete change in how South Korea is dealing with the human rights issue. Once again, South Korea led on the resolution at the United Nations on North Korea, on addressing human rights issues. So South Korea has put human rights back on the agenda. And the fact that President Yoon appointed Ambassador Shinwan Lee very early in his administration as the North Korea human rights envoy is also a very powerful sign of their wanting to make sure that human rights was back on the agenda. So I've seen a dramatic shift, and I'm hoping that, it's like to say, that Yoon will place in his heart that he is now needs to be as concerned for a Korean in a detention center in China, a Korean in a refugee camp in Thailand, a Korean in a political prison camp in North Korea, a Korean on the KTX to Busan, a Korean at a Starbucks in Seoul. In other words, he needs to embrace the fact that all of these Koreans, he needs to put them first in his heart to protect the lives of Koreans wherever they are. So I definitely think that all that the Yoon administration has done is shown that they really care about the human rights situation. So.
윤석열 대통령이 사실 이번에 미사일 표차로 승리를 거두셨는데 그 중에 이제 큰 몫을 차지한 분들이 이제 탈북자들, 그래서 다음에 거의 다 이제 윤석열 대통령을 이제 찍어준 거로 알고 있습니다. 잘 아시겠지만 뭐 어민 2명이 이제 탈출을 하고 또 자유민주주의를 위해서 이제 탈출을 했는데 사실은 뭐 그보다 더 많은 뭐 100명 이상의 뭐 어민들이 배를 타고 온다고 해도 결국은 이제 자유를 찾고 민주적인 그 나라를 생활을 영위하기 위해서 오는 거로 다 나만 지금 정부에서 일을 하고 있고요. 지금 윤석열 대통령이 이제 정권을 잡고 난 다음에 이신원 인권 대사를 유엔 대표로 보내셔서 이제 지금 계속 추진되고 있습니다만 그 북한 인권 문제를 채택하고 하는데 열심히 노력을 하고 계신 거로 제가 알고 있어요. 그리고 이제 윤석열 대통령이 뭐 북한 지금 인권을 위해서 노력하시고 또 중국에 있는 그 구금되어 있는 분들 600명 대해서도 노력을 해야 되고 또 한국에 있는 모든 그 뭐 작은 시민들 뭐 아까 말씀하신 스타벅스에서 뭐 커피를 먹는 국민들이나 뭐 KTX 타고 다니는 국민들 전부 다 사실은 윤석열 대통령이 그분의 인권을 또 같이 염려하고 해야 될 대통령직이기 때문에 점점 이제 나아질 것으로 생각을 하고 계십니다.
지금 한국 정부하고 그 숄츠 대표님하고 이렇게 서로 얘기가 있는지 또 한번 좀.
Are you communicating with the South Korean government currently with your?
Well, we had during North Korea Freedom Week. We held North Korea Freedom Week. We usually have it in April, but we held it in September for the first time. This was the 19th annual North Korea Freedom Week. It's the first time we delayed it until September because we wanted it to be able to meet in person because of COVID.
In this year.
Yes, it was. We had it in September in Seoul.
I see.
And the meetings that we had, the engagement we had with the administration was very positive about the human rights issues and expressing their concerns. And I think they were really, really impressed with the North Korea Freedom Week, which was entirely organized by the North Korean defector leaders with South Korean human rights activists. And it was an incredible week. And I think that we really impressed the administration. And I know they reached out again to meet with some of the defector leaders that organized it. But they were very receptive and very affirming of their concerns about the human rights issues.
지난 9월 마지막 주에 이제 팬데믹 때문에 그동안 미뤘던 이제 19번째 북한 인권 대회를 가졌었습니다. 그때 이제 대부분의 행사를 이제 탈북민들 단체들이 전부 행사를 주관하셨고 또 한국에 있는 또 이제 북한 주민 인권을 위해서 일하는 단체들이 같이 일을 하셨고 그때 한 일주일 내내 활동적으로 미디어도 타고 했습니다. 그래서 그분들을 지금까지 같은 사실 단체예요. 그래서 한국 정부가 그분들하고 지금도 계속 연락을 하고 있는 것으로 알고 있습니다.
마지막으로 제가 드리고 싶은 질문이 그 미국 의회에서 이 한국 레퓨지 문제를 어떻게 도와줄 수 있는지.
Okay. The last question is in detail. How could the U.S. Congress or Senate could help the North Korean human rights issue?
Well, they haven't appointed a special envoy yet. And I was willing to give President Biden I was willing to be patient because it took President Bush, took President Obama 9 months to appoint a special envoy, and Trump never appointed one. But I'm hoping that we will see the appointment of a North Korea human rights envoy soon to work with Ambassador Shinhwa Lee. So that's one thing, because that's a very important to have someone who's constantly engaged in raising these human rights issues. I also think passing the North Korea Human Rights Act, it was delayed. It should have passed this summer, but it was delayed because of the election. So we're hoping it's going to pass sometime during this lame duck session. So I think that's very important. We also want to see our government, the United States government, engage more and accept more refugees. But also, we'd love to see them do more to support the North Korea NGOs that are doing the actual work of reaching out to people in North Korea.
바이든 대통령이 사실 그 휴먼 라이츠 엔보이를 꾸려가지고 그 우리 그 이신원 그 인권 대사와 같이 일을 할 수 있도록 사실 미국 정부에서 하셔야 되는데 아직까지 안타깝게 정확 꾸려지지가 않았어요. 그래도 이제 지난 팬데믹 때문에 사실 지난 여름에 휴먼 라이츠 액트가 패스가 됐어야 되는데 지금 이제 미뤄지고 아마 유엔에서는 12월 달에 이제 그렇게 패스 될 걸 알고 아마 걔도 미국 정부에서도 그걸 이제 민주당들이 인권 그걸 많이 하기 때문에 아마 패스가 되게 노력할 거로 이해하고 있습니다. Last question.
지난 몇 년 전에 그 문재인 정부일 때 그 공개서 하나 갖다 보냈잖아요. 그 북한 인권에 해가지고 거기다 답변을 받으셨습니까?
During the Moon Jae-in era, you sent an open letter. 공개 서신
예,
타이틀.
공개서 질의를 했었죠.
누구한테 타이틀이 제목이 사실 많이
그러니까
우리가 많이 보냈어요.
누가 그
사실.
공개 성화를
아니 그때
보냈다는
저기
거죠?
네, 근데 우리가 좀 많이 보냈어요. 그 아시는 게 하나씩 모르는데 타이틀 많이.
솔티께서
예, 예.
공개적으로 문재인 정부한테다가 그 북한 인권에 대해 가지고
You
공개 질의를
personally
해주고
sent open letter to 문재인.
응.
About refugee.
그러니까
예, 2년
북한-
전인가 2년 전에 2019년에 공개 질의를 한다고
2019.
언론에 봤었는데 그때 그 답을 받으셨는지 거기다 그 질의에 대한 답을
to open the
받으셨는지
letter, he's asking if you ever received the answer, reply letter from 문재인.
No.
Okay, that's simple.
I will say that we did quite a number of letters
예.
to Moon
Yeah,
about
그러게,
the
좀 많이
refugees, trying to
그랬겠다,
save the refugees.
And you received no letter from Moon Jae-in.
No, I did have the door
우리
slammed.
많이
I did
보냈어요.
have the door slammed in my
타이핑.
face. But I will say that we got an immediate response to an appeal we sent to President Yoon about the refugees. We got an immediate response.
그러니까 윤석열 대통령한테 보냈을 때는 바로 이제 근데 답을 받았다고.
아,
예.
어떤 답을 받으셨죠?
Okay, in detail, what is the reply? The content of his reply from Yoon.
Oh, I had a follow-up meeting that they're very much affirmed that they were trying to do what they can regarding the refugees.
그러니까 현 정부에서 이제 할 수 있는 일들을 그 탈북자들 위해서 할 수 있는 건 하겠다고 그렇게 확인 답을 받으셨다.
아니 그럼 마지막으로
오케이.
많은 뭐랄까 뭐 환경운동가도 있고 많은 여러 가지 관심사를 갖고 있는데 왜 특별하게 그 북한 인권에 대해서 이렇게 평생 일을 하시는지 어떤 계기가 계셨는지.
Just briefly, just your final remarks on. Of course, there are many issues you could participate as an NGO status, etc. But why have you chosen North Korean human rights for you to dedicate your time, energy, and effort? Just final reply from that, please.
God, honestly, that's the answer. Back in the 1990s, I prayed once to God to break my heart for what was breaking His heart, and I noticed what's happening in North Korea is breaking God's heart, and that's why I do this, because it hasn't been easy. But I know that Korea is on God's heart. And I believe Korea is very dear to God because the people in Korea, Pyongyang revival in 1907, just the amazing things that the church there was doing, and what's happened, the darkness that came in. I know that, in fact, I talk about this, I'm going to mention this in my speech, but a couple of years ago, I got a call from a woman named Kathy Walters, who is actually was living in Macon, Georgia. I know she just moved to North Carolina, but she had this powerful dream of praying hands coming up out of the dirt, and God told her those were the martyrs of Korea that loved me more than their own lives. I've never forgotten them, and the darkness that came over that land, it will be swept away, and there will be sudden freedom. Now she had no idea about North Korea, but she went on the internet, typed in North Korea human rights and everything, and my name popped up. She reached out to me and she told me that story. But I do think it's because of my faith, and God called me to do this, and that's what's kept me going. And then hearing things like that, I know things are going to change, and I know they're going to have sudden freedom, but we need to be the ones that are speaking out for them.
순 여사는 말씀하시는 이제 북한 인권을 운동을 하기 시작한 사실 신앙 때문에 그렇게 하셨다고 기도를 하나님한테 할 때 하나님이 뭐가 제일 슬프시냐고 물어봤을 때 바로 그 답이 자기한테 왔고 북한 인권을 하나님이 제일 이제 슬퍼하시고 그렇게 하셨기 때문에 자기한테 이제 좀 미션을 택하십니다. 오늘도 뭐 좀 더 이제 강의 때 말씀하시겠지만 캐티라는 여성이 이제 꿈을 꿔서 자기한테 연락이 왔대요. 그 꿈에서 흙더미에서 손이 올라오는 꿈을 꿨는데 하나님께서 그 손은 그러니까 그 자기 목숨보다 하나님을 더 사랑하는 한국의 순교자들이다. 북한 인권을 위해서 죽어가는 순교자들 그런 답을 받아서 그분은 북한을 몰랐는데 이제 인터넷 찾아가지고 이제 북한 인권을 치니까 이제 수잔 숄트여서 이름이 나와서 자기 전화를 해서 이제 그런 그것도 결국은 그분도 신앙적인 답을 받으신 거. 그래서 결국 자기가 물어보신 질문에 대한 답은 이제 하나님에 대한 신앙이요. 그걸 이제 사명으로 받고 지금 진행하신다고 말씀하십니다.